Hello, how are you? I hope you guys are doing swell. I am coming today to present Florida's slave narratives. I don't know how many people read them before. If you haven't read them, sit back, relax, and let me read them for you. Let's go. In October 1939, the Jacksonville Journal published a story describing a federally funded project going on in Florida that would have a far-reaching impact on future scholarship. In 1935, Florida, with its 1,500,000 population, was still politically and philosophically in the 19th century. It was a large state with a relatively underdeveloped economy based on agriculture, tourism, and attractive industries. Tallahassee was a small town filled biannually with conservative small town and rural-oriented legislators who politically dominated the state. The Depression served as a dynamic house of change, forcing politicians and artists to adjust to a new order. Roosevelt's New Deal sponsored the Federal Writers Project. It originated in 1935 legislation formally designated Federal Number 1. The WPA, aka Works Project Amend bill, was created to establish art programs. Roosevelt approved the bill in closing the Federal Writers Program in September 1935. He authorized a trial expenditure of $6,288,000 and a staff of 6,500. $6 million at that time is equivalent to like $100 million today. That's what they said. The director of the project, Henry G. Alsberg, displayed particular sensitivity towards developing a program capable of capturing the Afro-American legacy, a collection which would include folklore, institutional studies, life history, and slave narratives. Alsberg had inherited a rudimentary program designed to interview ex-slaves as a part of the 1934 Federal Emergency Relief Administration. The Federal Writers Project, with its magnificent array of programs, offered Black writers opportunities to showcase their talents. Ralph Ellison, Richard Wright, Margaret Walker, Frank Yerby, and Florida's Zora Neale Hurston piled their crafts at various projects during the 1930s. Racism, of course, had not dissipated. A February 1937 report disclosed that Blacks constituted only 106 of the Federal Writers Project's 4,500 employees. Doesn't sound too different today, right? They can have a project and hire about 10,000 white people and then hire about 20 Black people and say that, hey, they believe in diversity. Let's continue. The Office of the Negro Affairs lobbied vigorously for the hiring of more Black writers. Still do the same thing today, right? 2023. Florida played an important role in the conception of the slave narrative. Now, let's listen to the hearts of ex-slaves via their interviews for the Florida slave narratives. But wait, since we are discussing slavery, Florida, and Black Americans, let's talk a little bit about the history of immigrant Italians and white racism in America. Ooh. Some groups want to forget that they went through racist issues with white Americans as well, right? They want to forget when they get all those benefits for being anti-Black, right? Let's find out why so many Italians, some in government roles today in 2023, have so much blatant or hidden animosity towards Black America. Shall we? Labor struggles were not the only conflicts Italian immigrants faced. During the years of the Great Italian Migration, they also had to confront a wave of grave hostility and insurmountable prejudice. As immigrations, from Europe and Asia neared its crest in the late 19th century, anti-immigrant sentiment soared along with it. The U.S. was in the grips of an economic depression, and immigrants were blamed for taking American jobs. At the same time, racialist theories circulated in the press, advancing pseudo-scientific theories that alleged that Mediterranean types were inherently inferior to people of Northern European heritage. Sound familiar? Drawings and songs caricaturing the new immigrants as childlike, criminal, or subhuman became sadly commonplace. One 1891 cartoon claimed that if immigration was properly restricted, you would never be troubled with socialism, the mafia, and such kindred evils. I guess some Italians kind of like want to forget that part of America history. Attacks on Italians were not limited to the printed page. From the late 1880s, anti-immigrant societies sprang up around the country, and the KKK saw a spike in membership. Catholic churches and charities were vandalized and burned, and Italians attacked by mobs. In the 1890s alone, more than 20 Italians were lynched. Now, before you go and say, well, yeah, we know about the racist history against us Italians, but we just choose not to cry and complain like the blacks do. Let me tell you something. You guys aren't continuing to be treated as you did when you migrated here. And you weren't put in chains. So you guys were allowed to assimilate. You guys were allowed to assimilate into white culture. And you were allowed to build your own communities and businesses and build empires and pass on generational wealth to your people. You were allowed to do that. You didn't have your towns burned down consistently. Anytime you took a step forward, somebody came and pulled you 10 steps backwards. So you guys you weren't treated as horrifically as Black Americans were. But you was treated bad though. But then they also chilled on you and allowed you to go on your merry way, only if you agreed to be anti-Black. Let's be real with it. And Italians don't like Black folks. And it's being said that Italians aren't white. Just like a whole lot of other ethnicities aren't naturally white. It's a such thing called whitewashing that was going on around the globe. So let's continue. One of the bloodiest episodes took place in New Orleans in 1891 when the chief of police was found shot to death on the street one night. The mayor blamed Sicilian gangsters and rounded up more than 100 Sicilian Americans. Eventually, 19 were put on trial, and as the nation's Italian Americans watched nervously, were found not guilty for lack of evidence. Before they could be free, however, a mob of 10,000 people, including many New Orleans' most prominent citizens, broke into the jail. They dragged 11 Sicilians from their cells and lynched them, including 2 men jailed on other offenses. Anti-immigrant sentiment continued until the 1920s. Let me repeat that. Anti-immigrant sentiment continued into the 1920s when severe restrictions on immigrations were put into place by the U.S. Congress. When this legislation passed, the great era of Italian immigration came to an end, along with the severe racist attacks against you. See, it ended, but it never ended for Black Americans. So before you go on tooting your horn and say, yeah, we just don't complain about it. Yeah, you didn't have to continue to complain about it because you didn't continue to go through the same BS. Now let's get back to Florida slave narratives. By the way, let me remind you, Black folks, the ancestors of Black Americans were the only group that was literally put in chains and made to be slaves and bought and sold like chattels. So until your group was put into the same predicament in this country, you can shut up. And yes, I said shut up. Or would you rather me say be quiet? Let's continue. Interview with ex-slaves. Samuel Simon Andrews Parsons was born November the 18th, 1850 in Macon, Georgia, at a place called Tainton Square, where slaves were held, housed, and sold. Speculators, persons who traveled from place to place with slaves for sale, had housed 84 slaves there, many of whom were pregnant women. Parsons lived on the Lane Plantation until he was 8 years old, when he was sold to Lewis Ripley of Beaufort, South Carolina. He lived there for 2 years until he was sold to Ed Tillman of Dallas, Texas. He was at Tillman Plantation for a year until he was purchased by John Troy of Union Springs, Alabama, the richest slaveholder in Union Springs, Alabama. Parsons remained with Tillman until emancipation. He recalls that during one of these sales, about $800 was paid for him. $800 whooping dollars. That's how, wow, $800. A.J. Lane was Parsons' enslaver. During the Civil War, wheat, corn, and dried potatoes were parched and used as substitutes for coffee. I guarantee you it's more healthier than the stuff you guys drink. Then you wonder why you're having all these illnesses. His mother was given a peck of flour every 2 weeks. A mixture of salt and sand was dug from the earthen floor of the smokehouse and water poured over it to get the salt drippings for seasoning. Most medicine consisted of boiled roots. Thread and cloth were dyed with the dye obtained from maple bark. Shoes were made on a wooden lath, and soles and uppers fastened together with maple pegs. White preachers preached, "Obey your masters." The first buggy that Parsons saw was owned by his master, A.J. Lane. It had a seat at the rear with a rest, which was usually occupied by a man who was called the waiter. Parsons ran away twice to escape the whippings. He hid in asparagus beds in Sparta, Georgia until nightfall. When he returned, the master would not whip him because he was apprehensive that he might run away again and be stolen by poor whites and thus cause trouble. The richer whites, Parsons relates, were afraid of the poor whites. If poor whites were made angry, they would round up the owner's sheep and turn them loose into their cotton fields, and the sheep would eat the cotton row by row. Vindictive people. He compares the relationship between the rich and poor whites during slavery with that of the white and Negro people today. You know, before slavery in this country, as I said in another video some time ago, that the only issue that black and white folks had, and including Indians and other ethnicities that were here during that time, was rich and poor. It didn't matter what color that person was who was rich. It was still an issue, rich and poor. That was the only problem they had. And white and black people lived harmoniously together in communities. And their main issue was the rich people, pre-slavery. Let me let that sink in. With a face full of frowns, Parsons tells of a white man persuading his mother to let him tie her to show that he was master, promising not to whip her, and she believed him. When he had placed her in a buck, hands tied on a stick so that the stick would turn her in any direction, he whipped her until the blood ran down her back. With changed expression, Parsons told of an incident during the Civil War. Slaves, he explained, had to have passes to go from one plantation to another, and if one were found without a pass, the patrollers would pick him up and return him to his master and receive a pay for their service. The patrollers were guards for runaway slaves. One night they came to Aunt Rhoda's house, where a crowd of slaves had gathered and were going to return them to their masters. Uncle Humphrey, the tanner, quickly spaded up some hot ashes and pitched it on them. All of the slaves escaped unharmed, while all of the patrollers were badly injured. No one ever told on Uncle Humphrey, and when Aunt Rhoda was questioned by her master, she stated that she knew nothing about it.
Girl, I don't blame you. I wouldn't have told either.
Emancipation came, and with its great rejoicing, he recalls that Republicans were called radicals. Just after the close of the Civil War, Mr. Lane was able... What? Girl! Sorry about that minor interference. Let's continue. Mr. Lane was able to save all of his meat, silver, and other valuables during the war by having a cave dug in the hog pasture. The hogs trampled over it daily. Parsons states that among the papers in his trunk, he has a piece of money called shin plasters, which was used during the Civil War. The slaves were not allowed to attend schools of any kind, and school facilities immediately following emancipation were very poor.
Again, I said sometime, I don't know if I said it in video, but I was talking about the education of black folks in this country, where it might seem that black people are kind of behind in a lot of things. Not saying anything about them being mentally slow, like some wicked groups like to say falsely. Black people had to literally fight to learn. What other group in this country had to fight to go to school? Literally had to fight, which was one of the reasons the civil rights came about in the 60s. Name one other group that had to fight to go to school, or be killed, or threatened to be killed if they picked up a book to read. Ooh, ludicrous.
Dorsey came to Umatilla, Florida in 1882 by way of Georgia with a Mr. Rogers and 6 other men, their wives, and children to work on the railroad. He was made the section boss, a job he held until a white man threatened to dock him because he was wearing a stiff shirt and setting over a white man when he should have a shovel. That was the white man's opinion. This was the opinion of a man in the vicinity, but another white friend named Javis warned him and advised him not to leave Umatilla, but persuaded him to work for him cutting cordwood, although Parson had never seen wood corded. He accepted the job and was soon given a pass to Macon, Georgia to get other men. He brought back 13 men and soon became their boss. Parson bought a house and decided to do a little hunting. When he left his job, he did some hotel work, cooked, and served as train porter. In 1892, he was ordained to preach and has preached and pastored until 1894. Parson does not believe in taking medication, but making a liniment with which he rubs himself. He attributes his long life to his sense of having quitting sense and not allowing death to catch him unawares. Austin Bill. Austin Bill says his name is not Williams. He is an ex-slave who gained his freedom because his mistress found it more advantageous to free him than to watch him. Austin lives near Greenwood, Jackson County, Florida, on a small farm that he and his children operate. He says that he does not know his age, does not remember ever having heard it. But he must be pretty old, he says, because I was a right smart size when Mr. Smith went off to fight. He thinks he may be over 100 and he looks it, but he is not sure. Frank Berry, born in 1858 of a mother who was part of the human chattel belonging to one of the Hieronymus of Alachua County in Florida. He served as a state and federal government contractor, United States Marshal in 1881, and registration inspector in 1879. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, Berry was only 8. He remembers little of his life as a slave. The master made no provision for his freedom, as did many other Southerners, usually in the form of land grants, although he gave them their freedom as soon as the proclamation was issued. It was during the war between the Indians and settlers that Barry's grandmother, serving as a nurse at Tampa Bay, was captured by the Indians and carried away to become the squaw of their chief. She was later recaptured by her owners. This was a common procedure according to Barry's statement. Indians often captured slaves, particularly the women, or aided in their escape and almost always intermarried with them. The red men were credited with inciting many uprisings and helping slaves escape. Barry recalls the old days of black aristocracy, when Negroes held high political offices in the state of Florida. Negro tradesmen and professionals competed successfully and unmolested by the whites. Many fortunes were made by men who are now little more than beggars.
See how that happens? Black folks pull themselves up by bootstraps they don't even have. And then what happens?
Taylor Gilbert was born in Shelman, Georgia, 91 years ago to a colored woman and a white father.
Which is why I'm so white,
he adds. He has never been known to have passed as white, even though he most certainly could have without detection. David Ferguson bought Jacob Gilbert from Dr. Gilbert as a husband for Emily, Taylor's mother. Emily had 9 children, 2 by a white man, Francis and Taylor, and 7 by Jacob, only 3 of whom Gilbert remembers. 2 of these children were sent to school while the others were obliged to work on the plantation. Emily, the mother, was the cook and washwoman while Jacob was the butler. Gilbert, a good-sized lad when slavery was at its height, recalls vividly the cruel lashings and other punishments slaves endured when they so-called disobeyed their masters or attempted to run away. It was the custom of slaves who wished to go from one plantation to another to carry passes in case they were stopped as suspected runaways. Frequently, slaves would visit without benefit of passes, and as a result, they suffered severe torturing. Often, the sons of the slave owners would go Negroes hunting, and nothing, not even murder, was too horrible for them to do to slaves caught without passes. They justified their fiendish acts by saying that
the Negroes tried to run away when told to stop.
Let's run back and talk about
police brutality. Why is it so hard to believe that some white police officers are just straight out brutes and killers when it comes to people who look like me? There's a history of this in this country that people want to kind of like brush under the rug. That rug that you guys keep brushing filth under has a huge hump hill in it. That it ain't even a hill, it's big as Mount Everest, but you want to walk around it and keep ignoring it. One day you have to deal with that big huge mountain of filth you brushed under that rug. You have to deal with it.
Gilbert cannot remember when he came to Florida, but he claims that it was many years ago. Like the majority of Negroes after slavery, he became a farmer, which occupation he still pursues. He married once, but
my wife got to messing around with another man, so I sent her home to her mama. He didn't say mama, he sent her home to her mother.
The Life of Florida Clayton is interesting in that it illustrates the miscegenation prevalent during the days of slavery. Interesting also is the fact that Florida was not even a slave, though she was the product of those turbulent days. Many years before her birth, March 1st, 1854, Florida's great-grandfather, a white man, came to Tallahassee, Florida from Washington District of Columbia with his children whom he had by his Negro slave. On coming to Florida, he set all of his children free except one boy, Amos, who was sold to a major ward. No one knew why Amos was chosen to be sold to ward. Florida, named for the state in which he was born, was one of the 7 children born to Charlotte Morris, a colored woman, and David Clayton, a white man. Florida can recall the Negress hunters and the Negress stealers of her childhood days. Mr. Nimrod and Mr. Sheehy, both white, specialized in catching runaway slaves with their trained bloodhounds. Her parents always warned her and her brothers and sisters to go someone's yard whenever they saw these men with their dogs, lest the ferocious animals tear them to pieces. In regards to the Negress stealers, Florida tells of a covered wagon which used to come to Tallahassee at regular intervals and camp in some secluded spot. The children attracted by the old wagon would be eager to go near it, but they were always told to steer clear of the old luring wagon. It was not until later years that Florida and other children learned that the driver of the wagon was a Negress stealer who stole children and took them to Georgia to sell to the slave markets. Coates' father Charles. Father Charles Coates, as he is called by all who know him, was born a slave 108 years ago at Richmond, Virginia, on the plantation of a man named Longla. His early boyhood days were spent on the Longla plantation, filled with duties such as minding hogs, cows, bringing in wood, and such like work. His clothing consisted of one garment, a shirt made to reach below the knees and with 3/4 sleeves. He wore no shoes until he was a man past 20 years of age. The single garment was worn summer and winter alike, and the change in the weather did not cause an extra amount of clothes to be furnished for the slaves.
That's a damn shame.
They were required to move about so fast at work that the heat from the body was sufficient to keep them warm.
Oh my God.
Charles Coates remembers vividly the cruelties practiced on the Hall plantation. His duty was to see that all the slaves reported to work on time. The bell rung at 5:30 in the morning by one of the slaves. Charles was assigned to ring the bell for 3 years, in addition to carriage driving. He tells with laughter how the slaves would grab a piece of meat and bread and run to the field as no time was allowed to sit and eat breakfast. This was a very different way from that of the master he had before, as Mr. Longla was much better to his slaves. On the Hall plantation, there was a contraption similar to gallows, where the slaves were suspended and whipped. At the top of this device were blocks of wood with chains running through the holes. The device was high enough that a slave, when tied to the chains by his fingers, would barely touch the ground with his toes. This was done so that the slave could not shout or twist his body while being whipped. The whippings was prolonged until the body of the slave was covered with welts and blood trickled down its naked body. Women were treated in the same manner, and a pregnant woman received no more leniency than a man. Very often, after severe flogging, a slave's body was treated to a bath of water containing salt and pepper so that the pain would be more lasting and aggravated. The whipping was done with sticks in a whip called the cat o' nine tails, meaning every lick meant 9. The cat o' nine tails was a whip of 9 straps attached to a stick. The straps were perforated so that everywhere the hole in the strap fell on the flesh, a blister was left.
You know what? Let me hear one of these fools say one more time how slavery wasn't that bad. Let me hear it. I'm going to start a campaign against you. That's all I'm going to say.
The treatment given by the overseer was very terrifying. He recollects how a slave was put in a room and locked up for 2 and 3 days at a time without water or food because the overseer thought he hadn't done enough work in a given time.
Don't it seem like some white folks, if a black person ain't working until the flesh falls from their fingers and their bones are exposed, they feel like they ain't working? They call them lazy. Don't it seem like it gives them satisfaction to see a black person working so hard that they can just fall out dead because they work so hard? Seem like, no matter what you do and how much you work, you're not working hard enough. That's that damn master-slave mentality. White folks need to realize they ain't overseers and masters on plantations no more. You better wake up for you F around and find out. You're going to mess with the right one.
Another offense which brought forth severe punishment was that of crossing the road to another plantation. A whipping was given, and very often the slave was put on starvation for a few days. Charles relates an incident of a slave named Sambo.
Quite fitting when you hear this story.
He thought himself very smart and who courted the favor of the master.
In other words, he kissed the master's anus.
The neighboring slaves screamed so loudly while being whipped that Sambo told his master that he knew how to make a contraption which, if a slave was put into the device while being whipped, it would prevent him from making a noise. Master, I can shut them slaves up. I can shut them up where they won't scream so loud. Want me to make this contraption for you, master? Well, yes, Sambo. Make the contraption for us. The device was made of 2 blocks of wood cut to fit the head and could be fastened around the neck tightly. When the head was put inside, the upper and lower parts were clamped together around the neck so that the slave could not scream. The same effect as choking. The stomach of the victim was placed over a barrel which allowed freedom of movement. When the lash was administered and the slave wiggled, the barrel moved. Now, it so happened that Sambo was the first to be put into his own invention for a whipping. How?
A fool. The overseer, see, that should teach you how not to jump. Always jump to set up a trap for your brother that look like you.
The overseer applied the lash rather heavily, and Sambo was compelled to wiggle his body to relieve his feelings. And wiggling, the barrel under his stomach rolled a bit, straining Sambo's neck and breaking it. After Sambo died from his neck being broken, the master discontinued the use of the device as he saw the loss of property in the death of a slave.
He didn't care. He didn't have no feelings about the ass kisser dying. He wanted his property destroyed. He like, damn you, Sambo, and lost the slave because of your ass.
Charles was still a carriage driver when freedom came. He had opportunity to see and hear many things about the master's private life. When the news of the advance of the Union Army came, Mr. Hall carried his money to a secluded spot and buried it in iron pots so that the soldiers who were confiscating all the property and money they could would not get his money. The slave owners were required to notify the slaves that they were free, so Mr. Hall sent his son, Sherrod, to the cabins to notify all the slaves to come into his presence, and there he had his son to tell them that they were free. The Union soldiers took much of the slave owners' property and gave it to the slaves, telling them that if the owners took the property back to write and tell them about it. The owners only laughed because they knew the slaves could not read or write.
And that's how they wanted it. You notice how they don't have a problem with foreigners coming over here, right? Not really knowing the language, because they like to take advantage of them. And these foreigners come over here thinking they just, they gonna grab a hold of the American dream. Yeah, right.
After the soldiers had gone, the timid and scared slaves gave up most of the land. Some few, however, fenced in a bit of land while the soldiers remained in the vicinity, and they managed to keep a little of the land. Many of the slaves remained with the owners. There they worked for small monthly wages and took whatever was left of cast-off clothing and food and whatever the old missus gave them. A pair of old pants of the master was highly prized by them.
I'm sure it was. Some people feel so lowly about themselves, they'll take the crumbs off of people's tables who don't look like them.
Douglas Dorsey, an ex-slave born in Suwannee County, Florida in 1851, 14 years prior to freedom. His parents, Charlie and Ann Dorsey, were natives of Maryland and free people. In those days, Dorsey relates, there were people known as Negress tenders who used any means to catch Negress and sell them into slavery. There was one Jeff Davis who was known as a professional Negress trader. His slave boat docked in...
Can you imagine? Oh, anyway.
His slave boat docked in the slip of Maryland, and Jeff Davis and his henchmen went out looking for their victims. Unfortunately, his mother Anna and his father were caught one night and were bound and gagged and taken in Jeff Davis' boat, which was waiting in the harbor, and there they were put into stocks. The boat stayed in port until it was loaded with Negroes, then sailed for Florida, where Davis disposed of his human cargo.
See how much these people was capitalizing.
Douglas Dorsey's parents were sold to Colonel Lewis Medhare, who had a large plantation that was cultivated by 85 slaves. Colonel House was of the pretentious Southern colonial type, which was quite prevalent during that period. Colonel had won his title because of his participation in the Indian War in Florida. He was a typical wealthy Southern gentleman and was very kind to his slaves. His wife, however, was just the opposite. She was exceedingly mean and could easily be termed a tyrant. The missus, being a very cruel woman, would whip the slaves herself for any misdemeanor. Dorsey recalls an incident that is hard to obliterate from his mind. It is as follows. Dorsey's mother was called by the missus, but she didn't hear the woman calling her. Dorsey's mother continued with her duties. Suddenly, the missus burst out in a frenzy of anger over the woman not answering. Anna explained that she did not hear her call. That made no difference to the female brute. The missus seized a large butcher knife and swung at Anna. Anna tried to duck out of the way of the lunatic, but wasn't fast enough. The long blade caught hold of her forearm and sliced a long gash in her arm. The act of unbelievable cruelty for no reason had Anna laid up for some time. Young Douglas was a witness to this brutal treatment of his mother, and he at that moment made up his mind to kill his mistress. He intended to put rat poison into her coffee that he usually served her. Fortunately, freedom came and saved him of this act, which would have resulted in his death. He relates another incident in regard to his mistress as follows. To his mother and father was born a little boy whose complexion was rather light. The missus at once began accusing the colonel as being the father of the child. Naturally, the colonel denied, but the missus kept harassing him about it until he finally agreed to his wife's desire and sold the child. It was taken from his mother's breast at the age of 8 months and auctioned off on the first day of January to the highest bidder. The child was bought by Captain Ross and taken across the Suwannee River into Hamilton County. 20 years later, he was located by his family. He was a grown man, married and farming. Young Douglas had the task each morning of carrying the mater's children books to school. Willie, a boy of 8, would teach Douglas what he learned in school. Finally, Douglas learned the alphabet and numbers. In some way, the missus learned that Douglas was learning to read and write. One morning after breakfast, she called her son, Willie, to the dining room where she was seated and then sent for Douglas to come there too. She then took a quill pen, the kind used at the time, and began writing the alphabet and numerals as far as 10. Holding a paper up to Douglas, she asked him if he knew what they were. He proudly answered in an affirmative, not suspecting anything. She then asked him to name the letters and numerals, which he did. She then asked him to write them, which he did. When he reached the number 10, very proud of his learning, she struck him with a heavy blow across the face, saying to him,
If I ever catch you making another figure anywhere, I'll cut off your right arm.
Naturally, Douglas and also her son Willie were much surprised, as each thought what had been done was quite an achievement. She then called Mariah, the cook, to bring a rope, and tying the two of them to the old colonial post on the front porch, she took a chair and sat between the two, whipped them on their naked backs for such a time that for 2 weeks their clothes stuck to their backs on a lacerated flesh.
She beat the out of her son too. You can't tell me that woman wasn't possessed by the devil.
To ease the soreness, Willie would steal grease from the house, and together they would slip into the barn and grease each other's backs. As to plantation life, Dorsey said that the slaves lived in quarters especially built for them on the plantation. They would leave for the fields at sunup and remain until sundown, stopping only for a meal which they took along with them. When the slaves left the fields, they returned to their cabins, and after preparing eating of their evening meal, they gathered around a cabin to sing and moan songs seasoned with African melodies. Sometimes the young men on the plantation would slip away to visit a girl on another plantation if they were caught by the patrols. While on these visits, they would be lashed on their bare backs as a penalty for their offense. A whipping post was used for this purpose. As soon as one slave was whipped, he was given the whip to whip his brother slave. Very often the lashes would bring blood very soon from the already lacerated skin, but this did not stop the lash until one received their due number of lashings.
You see how they made our folks treat one another? Oh, God. And I really do believe that some of these folks think that those seeds they planted ain't gonna never come back up. I guess because it's been over 400 years. You know, you would think that wasn't gonna happen. Yeah, I've been doing this. Our people been doing this for over 400 years. Please, there's nothing gonna happen to us for treating these Negroes this way. This is all they know. They like that we treat them this way. Okay, that day gonna come.
Rebecca Hooks, age 90. She was born in Jones County, Georgia, of Martha and Pleasant Lowe, who were slaves of William Lowe. The mother was a mulatto, offspring of William Lowe, and a slave woman who was half Cherokee. The father was also a mulatto, purchased from a nearby plantation. This blood mixture, Rebecca's parents were known as house Negroes and lived on quarters located in the rear of the big house. A house Negro was a servant whose duties consisted of chores around the big house, such as butler, maid, cook, stableman, gardener, and personal attendant to the man who owned him. These slaves were often held in high esteem by their masters, and of course fared much better than the other slaves on the plantation. Quite often they were mulattoes, as in the case of Rebecca's parents. There seemed to be a general belief among slave owners that mulattoes could not stand as much laborious work as pure-blooded Negro slaves. This accounts probably for the fact that the majority of ex-slaves now alive are mulattoes.
And you see, the division they intentionally caused among black folks. You got light skin, don't like dark skin don't like straight hair, don't like curly, thick, tightly curly, thick hair. And I when I hear a person look like me say good hair, you know, I want to just, ooh, it's so ignorant to me when I still hear a black person say good hair. Let me say good hair in my presence. I'm going to treat you like you in the elementary and need to be put in a corner, because ain't no damn way in the world in 2023 you going to sit here and still say good hair. All of our hair is good. We can do so many things with our hair. We have thick, strong, beautiful hair. And because somebody's hair is straight and curly, you want to say it's good hair compared to what? Thick, coarse hair? That's some sickness that need to be rooted out of our community. It's a damn shame.
The Lows were originally of Virginia and did not own as much property in Georgia as they had in Virginia. Rebecca estimates the number of slaves on this plantation as numbering no more than 25. They were treated kindly and cruelly by turns according to the whims of master and mistress, who were none too stable in their dispositions. There was no driver or overseer on this plantation, as Old Tom was devil enough himself when he wanted to be, observes Rebecca. While she never felt the full force of his cruelties, she often felt sorry for other slaves who were given a task too heavy to be completed in a given time. The master intentionally gave slaves work they could not complete in a timely manner as to vent his pent-up anger on the slaves. Punishment was always in the form of a severe whipping or revoking a slave's privilege, such as visiting other plantations, etc. As a child, Rebecca learned to taunt her mistress. At first, this was considered very amusing. Whenever she had not knitted her required number of socks during the week, she simply informed them that she had not done it because she had not wanted to. Besides, she was not a negress. This stubbornness, accompanied by hysterical tantrums, continued to cause Rebecca to receive many stiff punishments that might have been avoided. Her master had given orders that no one was ever to whip her, so devious methods were employed to punish her, such as marching her down a road with hands tied behind her back or locking her in a dark room for several hours with only bread and water. Rebecca resembled the master's daughter. The girl was really her aunt and very conscious of the resemblance. Both had brown eyes and long dark hair. They were about the same height, and the clothes of the young mistress fit Rebecca like a glove. To offset this likeness, Rebecca's hair was always cut very short. Finally, Rebecca rebelled at having her hair all cut off and blankly refused to submit to the treatment any longer. After this happening, the girls formed a dislike for each other, and Rebecca was guilty of doing every mean act of which she was capable to torment the white girl. Rebecca's mother aided and abetted her in this, often telling her things to do. Rebecca did not fear the form of punishment administered to her, and she had the cunning to keep on the good side of the master, who had a fondness for her because she was so much like the Lows. The mistress consistently demanded that Rebecca be sold or beaten. Master Low's ready response would always be, "Dear, you know the child can't help it. It's that cursed Cherokee blood in her." There seemed to be no very strong opposition to a slave's learning to read and write on the plantation, so Rebecca learned along with the white children. Her father purchased books for her with money he was allowed to earn from the sale of corn whiskey, which he made, or from work done on some other plantation during his time off. He was not permitted to buy freedom, however. All right, that's the end of part 2. I will be coming back with more Florida slave narratives as soon as possible. Thank you. I hope you enjoy this information. I am joyfully providing to those who want to know the truth and who just want to hear about history. I find that history is so fascinating on so many levels. That's why I'm a voracious avid reader, man. I read fiction books, I read nonfiction. I prefer suspense and mystery books. Okay, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Thank you for subscribing to those who have subscribed. Thank you to my subscribers. And I'll be back, as I said, with part 2 of Florida's slave narrative in a few clicks. Have a good night.